They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I never understood that phrase until I sat across from Marcus in that gleaming conference room, watching the color drain from his face as the realization slowly dawned on him. 10 years. It had taken 10 years for this moment to arrive, and as I watched him struggle to process what was happening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a decade: pure, undiluted satisfaction. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, from the day my world shattered into a million pieces and set me on this path of calculated retribution. It was a Tuesday. Isn't it always a Tuesday when your life falls apart? The most ordinary, unremarkable day of the week, the kind where you wake up thinking you know exactly how your day will unfold. I had been with Marcus for 7 years. 7 years of building a life together, of shared dreams and whispered promises about forever. We were supposed to get married that fall. The invitations were already ordered, sitting in neat stacks in my kitchen drawer, waiting to be addressed. I came home early that day because I'd been feeling sick. Just a nagging headache and some nausea that had been plaguing me all morning. I thought maybe I was coming down with something, so I decided to leave work early and surprise Marcus with dinner. I even stopped by his favorite Italian place and picked up that pasta dish he always ordered, the one with the ridiculously long name that I could never pronounce correctly. The house was quiet when I walked in, but that wasn't unusual. Marcus worked from home most days, and he often took calls in his office with the door closed. I set the takeout containers on the kitchen counter and called out to him. "Marcus? I'm home early. I brought dinner." No response. I figured he was on a call, so I decided to go upstairs and change out of my work clothes. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Laughter. Female laughter, coming from our bedroom. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. There had to be an explanation. Maybe he was watching something on his laptop, or maybe he was on a video call with a client. The rational part of my brain was desperately trying to come up with innocent explanations, but my body already knew the truth. My hands were shaking as I climbed the stairs, each step feeling like it took an eternity. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. I could see movement inside, shadows dancing across the wall. And then I heard his voice. Marcus's voice, but not the way I'd ever heard it before. It was tender, intimate, full of an affection that I thought belonged only to me. "You're incredible, you know that?" he was saying. "I can't believe how lucky I am." I pushed the door open just a crack wider, and that's when I saw them. Marcus and a girl who couldn't have been older than 22, tangled together in the sheets of the bed we'd shared for 3 years. She was everything I wasn't. Young, blonde, with the kind of effortless beauty that comes from being born in the right decade. Her skin was flawless, unmarked by time or worry or the weight of adult responsibilities. The girl giggled, actually giggled, and said, "When are you going to tell her about us?" "I'm tired of sneaking around." Marcus stroked her hair, and I watched him do it with the same gentle motion he used to use on me. "Soon, baby. I promise. I just need to find the right time. She's been so stressed about the wedding planning, and I don't want to make it worse." "The wedding planning for a wedding that's never going to happen," she said with a laugh that cut through me like broken glass. "Exactly," Marcus replied, and then he kissed her forehead in a way that was so tender, so intimate, that I felt like I was going to vomit right there in the hallway. I don't remember backing away from the door. I don't remember walking back downstairs or grabbing my purse and keys. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store 3 miles away, sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. 7 years. 7 years of my life, and he was going to throw it all away for a child who probably still got carded at restaurants. The humiliation was almost worse than the heartbreak. How long had this been going on? How many times had I kissed him hello when he came home, not knowing where his mouth had been? How many nights had he held me and whispered sweet nothings while thinking about her? I sat in that parking lot for 2 hours, crying until I had no tears left. People walked by, loading their groceries into their cars, living their normal lives while mine crumbled around me. I kept thinking about all the signs I must have missed, all the little changes in his behavior that I'd rationalized away. The way he'd been staying up later, always on his phone. The new cologne he'd started wearing. The sudden interest in going to the gym 5 times a week. God, I'd been so stupid. So blind and trusting and pathetically naive. When I finally drove back to the house, his car was gone. The girl's car, a bright red convertible that screamed "Daddy's money," was gone too. I walked into our bedroom, and the bed was made with military precision, as if nothing had happened. but I could smell her perfume in the air, something floral and young and expensive. I sat on the edge of that bed and tried to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to pack all his things and throw them on the lawn. Part of me wanted to call him and scream until my voice gave out. But mostly I just felt hollow, empty, like someone had reached inside me and scooped out everything that made me who I was. Marcus came home 3 hours later, whistling as he walked through the front door. Whistling. Like he hadn't just destroyed 7 years of love and trust and shared dreams. Like he hadn't just ripped my heart out and stomped on it with his designer shoes. "Hey, babe," he called out, his voice cheerful and casual. "Sorry I missed you earlier. I was out running errands." Errands. That's what he called it. I was sitting in the living room, still in my work clothes, the takeout containers still unopened on the kitchen counter. When he saw me, his expression shifted slightly. Maybe he could see something in my face, or maybe he was just better at reading the room than I'd given him credit for. "Everything okay?" he asked, and I could hear the wariness creeping into his voice. "I came home early today," I said quietly. "I was feeling sick." He sat down across from me, and I studied his face for any sign of guilt or panic. But Marcus had always been good at compartmentalizing, at keeping his emotions locked away behind that charming smile. "Oh no, are you feeling better now?" he asked. "Maybe you should go lie down. I could make you some tea." The audacity of it was breathtaking. He was sitting there offering to take care of me, probably with the same hands that had been touching her just hours before. "I know about her," I said simply. The words hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. I watched his face carefully, looking for the moment when the mask would slip. It took exactly 3 seconds. His eyes widened slightly, and then he looked down at his hands. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The blonde girl?" I continued, my voice eerily calm. "The one who was in our bed this afternoon. The one who's tired of sneaking around." He looked up at me then, and for just a moment, I saw something that might have been regret flash across his face, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Sarah, How long?" I interrupted. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing. "Now it just made me sick." "It's not what you think," he said. It happened. I didn't plan for it to happen." "How long, Marcus?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see the calculations running through his head. How much did I know? How much could he get away with denying? 6 months, he finally admitted. 6 months. Half a year of lies and deception and making me feel crazy for noticing that something was wrong. 6 months of planning a wedding to a man who was already planning his exit strategy. "I want you to leave," I said. "Tonight? Sarah, please, can we talk about this? I know I messed up, but..." "No." The word came out harder than I intended. "There's nothing to talk about. I want you gone. This is my house too," he said, and there was a hint of defensiveness in his voice now. "We both signed the lease." "Then I'll leave," I said, standing up. "But I'm not spending another night under the same roof as you." I went upstairs and threw some clothes into a suitcase, my hands shaking with rage and adrenaline. Marcus followed me, talking the entire time, trying to explain or justify or minimize what he'd done. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was done listening to his voice, done believing his lies, done being the fool who trusted him completely while he made a mockery of everything we'd built together. I ended up at my sister's house that night, sobbing on her couch while she rubbed my back and told me what a bastard he was. Emma had never liked Marcus. She'd always said there was something about him that didn't sit right with her. I'd defended him for years, telling her she was being paranoid and judgmental. That night, as I cried myself to sleep in her guest room, I wished I'd listened to her instincts instead of ignoring my own. The next few weeks were a blur of legal consultations, apartment hunting, and the humiliating process of canceling a wedding. I had to call every vendor, every guest, and explain that the wedding was off. Most people were understanding, but I could hear the pity in their voices, and that almost made it worse. I'd become that woman, the one who got dumped for someone younger and prettier, the cautionary tale that other women would whisper about at parties. Marcus tried to reach out several times. He sent flowers to my office with a card that said, "I'm sorry." He left voicemails saying he wanted to explain, that it wasn't over between us, that he'd made a mistake, but I never responded. What was there to say? He'd made his choice, and now he had to live with it. The worst part wasn't even the heartbreak. It was the way it made me question everything about myself. Was I not pretty enough? Not young enough? Had I become boring and predictable? Was I not adventurous enough in bed? The thoughts circled in my mind like vultures, picking at my self-esteem until there was nothing left but raw, exposed doubt. I threw myself into work with the kind of desperate energy that comes from having nothing else to live for. I was working in marketing for a mid-sized tech company at the time, and I suddenly became the person who stayed late, who volunteered for the impossible projects, who said yes to every opportunity. My boss noticed, and within 6 months, I'd been promoted to senior marketing manager. But even as my career started to take off, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was damaged goods. I went on a few dates that year, set up by well-meaning friends who thought I needed to get back out there. But every time a man touched my hand or leaned in for a kiss, all I could think about was Marcus and that girl, and how easily I'd been replaced. It was almost a year later when I heard through mutual friends that Marcus and his blonde had broken up. Apparently, she'd gotten bored with him and moved on to someone else, someone richer, someone who could give her the Instagram-worthy lifestyle she craved. I felt a petty surge of satisfaction when I heard the news, followed immediately by shame for feeling that way. A few months after that, Marcus reached out again. This time it was a long email full of regrets and apologies and pleas for another chance. He said he'd realized what he'd lost, that he'd been a fool, that he wanted to fight for us. He said the girl had meant nothing, that it had been a midlife crisis or temporary insanity or whatever excuse seemed most palatable. I read that email 3 times, and each time I felt a different emotion. First, there was a tiny flutter of hope, the part of me that had loved him for 7 years and still remembered the good times. Then came anger. How dare he think he could just waltz back into my life after destroying it? And finally, there was something else, something cold and calculating that I'd never felt before. I didn't respond to his email. Instead, I started paying attention to his social media again, something I'd avoided for months. He looked older, more worn down. The confidence that had always been his most attractive feature seemed diminished. He'd posted a few photos from bars and parties, but they had a desperate quality to them, like he was trying too hard to prove he was having fun. Meanwhile, my own life was getting better. The promotion had led to another promotion, and I was now the head of marketing for a different company, a bigger company with better opportunities. I'd started going to therapy, working through the trust issues and self-doubt that Marcus had left me with. I'd even started dating again, though nothing serious had developed yet. But I hadn't forgotten. Every success I achieved, every step forward I took, was shadowed by the memory of that day I'd found him with her. The humiliation never fully faded, and sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd find myself thinking about revenge. Not anything dramatic or destructive. I wasn't going to slash his tires or post his secrets on social media. But I fantasized about a day when he would realize what he'd lost, when he would see me living my best life while he struggled with the consequences of his choices. I just never imagined it would take the form it eventually did. 2 years after the breakup, I met David at a conference in Chicago. He was keynoting a panel on emerging markets, and I was there representing my company's expansion into the Midwest. David was older than me, 45 to my 32, but he had the kind of confidence that came from actual accomplishment rather than bluster. He was successful, well-traveled, and most importantly, he treated me like an equal rather than a conquest. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours. We talked about business, about travel, about books and movies, and the kind of deep, meaningful things that Marcus and I had never really discussed. David was divorced, with 2 teenage kids he clearly adored, and he spoke about his ex-wife with respect rather than bitterness. It was refreshing to meet a man who could acknowledge that his marriage had ended without demonizing his former partner. We started dating long distance, which was complicated but also wonderful in its own way. David would fly to see me, or I'd visit him in Chicago, and every weekend felt like a mini vacation. He introduced me to new restaurants, new experiences, new ways of thinking about the world. With Marcus, I'd felt like I was shrinking, becoming smaller and more accommodating to fit his vision of what a girlfriend should be. With David, I felt like I was expanding, becoming more myself than I'd ever been. 6 months into our relationship, David asked me to move to Chicago. He'd been offered a position as CEO of a major consulting firm, and he wanted me to come with him. It was a huge step. I'd lived in the same city my entire adult life, and leaving would mean starting over in a lot of ways. But I was ready for a change, ready to put the past behind me completely. I found a job with a boutique marketing firm in Chicago, and David and I found a beautiful apartment in Lincoln Park. For the first time since Marcus, I felt genuinely happy. Not just content or distracted, but truly deeply happy. David proposed on the anniversary of our first meeting, and this time, when I said yes, I knew it was forever. We had a small, intimate wedding 6 months later. David's kids, Sarah and Michael, walked me down the aisle, a gesture that meant more to me than any traditional ceremony could have. My sister was my maid of honor, and she cried through the entire ceremony, telling me afterward that she'd never seen me look so radiant. The first few years of marriage were everything I'd dreamed they could be. David was supportive of my career, encouraging me to take risks and pursue opportunities that scared me. When the marketing firm I worked for was acquired by a larger agency, I was promoted to regional director. When David's company expanded internationally, I was offered the chance to head up their marketing division. We traveled together, built a life together, supported each other through challenges, and celebrated each other's successes. I felt like I'd finally found my person, not just someone to share my life with, but someone who made me want to be the best version of myself. It was 4 years into our marriage when David came home with news that would change everything. "I've been offered a position," he said over dinner one evening. "It's a big opportunity, but it would mean relocating again." "Where?" I asked, though I was already mentally preparing for another move. We'd talked about the possibility of relocating for the right opportunity. "Back home?" he said with a smile. "They want me to take over as CEO of Hartwell & Associates." I nearly choked on my wine. Hartwell & Associates was one of the most prestigious consulting firms in my former city, the city where I'd lived with Marcus, where I'd built my first career, where I'd experienced both love and heartbreak. It was also, as I would soon discover, the firm where Marcus now worked as a senior consultant. That's amazing," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. David reached across the table and took my hand. "I know it's a lot to ask going back there, but this is the kind of opportunity that only comes along once in a lifetime. And I was thinking, maybe it's time. Maybe you're ready to face those old ghosts." He didn't know about the fantasies I'd harbored, the quiet dreams of revenge that I'd never shared with him. David knew about Marcus, of course, knew that he'd broken my heart and left me for someone else. But he didn't know about the deeper wounds, the humiliation that still occasionally surfaced in my quieter moments. "What do you think?" he asked gently. I looked at my husband, this good, kind man who loved me unconditionally, and felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was time to face those ghosts. Maybe it was time to show that city and everyone in it exactly who I'd become. "I think," I said slowly, "that it sounds perfect." David's smile was radiant. "Really? You're not just saying that?" "Really," I confirmed, and as I said it, I felt a familiar flutter of anticipation in my chest. Not the desperate, painful longing I'd felt in those first years after Marcus, but something else, something that felt almost like destiny. We moved back 3 months later into a penthouse apartment that overlooked the river. David's new position came with a significant salary increase, and combined with my own earnings as a marketing executive, we were living a life that was far beyond anything I'd imagined for myself 10 years earlier. I'd changed in those 10 years, not just professionally, but personally. I was confident in a way I'd never been before, secure in my own worth and value. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to speak up for myself, to demand the respect I deserved. The woman who had sobbed in a grocery store parking lot was still part of me, but she was no longer the whole story. David started his new job with characteristic energy and enthusiasm, diving into the challenge of turning around a company that had been struggling with leadership issues and declining client satisfaction. He worked long hours those first few months, and I found myself with time to reconnect with old friends and explore the city I'd once called home. It was different seeing it through my new eyes. Places that had once held painful memories now felt neutral, just locations in a city where I happened to live. I ran into a few people I'd known from before, former colleagues, old acquaintances, and I could see the surprise in their faces when they saw how I'd changed. I was no longer the anxious, eager-to-please girl they remembered. I was poised, successful, confident in my own skin. But I hadn't run into Marcus yet. In the back of my mind, I knew it was inevitable. The city wasn't that large, and we moved in similar professional circles. I'd seen his name on client lists and industry publications, so I knew he was still around, still working in the same field. But months passed without a sighting, and I began to wonder if maybe I'd be lucky enough to avoid him entirely. That's when David came home with the news that would set everything in motion. "We're restructuring the consulting teams," he said one evening as we sat on our balcony, watching the sunset over the water. "I'm going to be working more directly with some of the senior consultants, really getting to know the talent we have." "That sounds like a good idea," I said absently, more focused on the glass of wine in my hand than on office politics. "There's one guy in particular I'm excited to work with," David continued. "Marcus Thompson. He's got an impressive client list, and his numbers are consistently strong. I'm thinking about fast-tracking him for a promotion to partner." The wine glass slipped from my hand and shattered on the concrete floor of the balcony. The sound seemed to echo in the evening air, sharp and sudden. "Sarah, are you okay?" David was immediately at my side, checking my hands for cuts, brushing glass away from my feet. "I'm fine," I said quickly, though my heart was racing. "Just clumsy. Sorry." As David cleaned up the glass, I tried to process what he'd just told me. Marcus worked for David's company. Not only that, but David was considering him for a promotion to partner, a position that would make him one of the highest-ranking employees in the firm. My ex-boyfriend, the man who had betrayed me and humiliated me and left me broken, was about to become my husband's business partner. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Almost. "This Marcus Thompson," I said carefully. "What do you know about him personally?" David looked up from where he was crouched, picking up the last of the glass shards. "Not much, really. He's divorced, I think. Or maybe never married? He keeps his personal life pretty private." "Why?" "Just curious," I said, and then made a decision that would change everything. "I'd love to meet him sometime. You know how I like to get to know your colleagues." David smiled up at me. "I'm sure that can be arranged. Actually, I was thinking about having a dinner party next month. Invite some of the senior staff and their partners. It would be a good way for you to meet everyone." "That sounds perfect," I said and meant it. As David went inside to get a broom for the smaller pieces of glass, I stood alone on the balcony, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the old heartbreak or the desperate longing for revenge I'd once harbored. This was something else entirely. This was opportunity. I thought about the woman I'd been 10 years ago, trusting, naive, so eager to please that I'd ignored my own instincts. I thought about Marcus, who had thrown away 7 years of love for a girl who'd discarded him as easily as she'd probably discarded the clothes he'd bought her. And I thought about the woman I was now. Successful, confident, married to a man who respected and valued me. Marcus had no idea that Sarah Mitchell had become Sarah Henderson, wife of his new CEO. He was going to walk into that dinner party expecting to meet his boss's wife, probably hoping to make a good impression, maybe even to network his way to that promotion he undoubtedly wanted. Instead, he was going to come face to face with his past and with the woman whose life he'd thought he'd ruined. I began to smile, a slow, satisfied expression that felt foreign on my face but surprisingly natural. Revenge is a dish best served cold, they say, and 10 years was plenty of time for it to chill. The next few weeks were a delicate balance of preparation and anticipation. I needed to plan the perfect dinner party, one that would showcase David's success and my own transformation, while also creating the ideal setting for my reunion with Marcus. I wanted everything to be flawless, from the menu to the guest list to the way I looked when he walked through our door. I hired a caterer and a florist, choosing elegant but understated touches that would impress without seeming overdone. I bought a new dress, a midnight blue silk number that hugged my curves in all the right places while maintaining an air of sophisticated elegance. I was no longer the girl who'd worn comfortable cardigans and sensible shoes. I was David Henderson's wife, and I looked the part. David was delighted with my enthusiasm for entertaining his colleagues. He'd worried that I might feel isolated, moving back to a city where I had complicated history, but my eagerness to integrate into his professional life seemed to reassure him that I was truly ready to build a new chapter here. "You know," he said one morning over coffee, "I think this dinner party is exactly what the team needs. Morale has been low since the leadership changes, and this kind of personal touch could really help bring everyone together. I'm glad I can help," I said, and I meant it. I wanted David to succeed, wanted his tenure as CEO to be everything he'd dreamed it would be. The fact that my personal agenda aligned with his professional goals made everything feel even more perfect. 3 days before the party, David brought home the final guest list. I scanned it casually, already knowing what I'd find, but still feeling a jolt when I saw his name written in David's neat handwriting, Marcus Thompson. "So he's definitely coming?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "Absolutely. He was one of the first to RSVP. I think he's eager to make a good impression. David paused, looking at me with concern. You seem nervous about this party. Is everything okay? Just want everything to be perfect, I said, which was true, if not complete. The night before the party, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, trying on the blue dress one final time. The woman looking back at me was someone Marcus had never met. She was poised, successful, beautiful in a way that came from confidence rather than youth. She was everything I'd become in the years since he'd discarded me, and tomorrow night, he was going to see exactly what he'd given up. I thought about calling him, warning him somehow about what he was walking into. For about 30 seconds, I considered it. But then I remembered the sound of that girl's laughter coming from our bedroom, and the moment of compassion passed. Marcus was going to get exactly what he deserved, the shock of his life. The morning of the dinner party dawned clear and bright, one of those perfect spring days that seemed designed for new beginnings. I woke up with a sense of calm I hadn't expected. No nervousness, no second guessing. Just a quiet certainty that everything was unfolding exactly as it should. I spent the day overseeing the final preparations, arranging flowers, polishing silver, making sure every detail was perfect. The caterers arrived at 4 to begin setting up, and by 6 o'clock, our apartment had been transformed into something that belonged in a magazine spread. David came home at 5:30, taking a quick shower and changing into his best suit. As he tied his tie, he caught my eye in the bathroom mirror. "You look incredible," he said softly. "Absolutely stunning." "Thank you," I replied, and I meant it. I felt incredible. I felt powerful and beautiful and ready for anything. The first guests arrived at 7, and I fell into the familiar rhythm of hostessing, greeting people at the door, making introductions, ensuring everyone had drinks and felt welcome. David's colleagues were an interesting group, a mixture of personalities and backgrounds united by their shared ambition and professional success. I found myself enjoying the evening more than I'd expected. These were accomplished, intelligent people, and the conversations were stimulating and engaging. For stretches of time, I almost forgot about the real reason for the party, caught up in the genuine pleasure of good company and good conversation. And then at 7:45, the doorbell rang. I was in the kitchen, checking on the appetizers, when I heard David's voice from the foyer. "Marcus, great to see you. Come in, come in." My heart began to race, but not with nervousness, with anticipation. I took a deep breath, checked my reflection in the chrome surface of the refrigerator, and walked toward the sound of voices. He was standing just inside the front door, handing his coat to David, when I appeared in the doorway. He looked older. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his hairline had receded slightly. But he was still handsome in that polished, professional way that had first attracted me all those years ago. "Marcus," David said warmly, "I'd like you to meet my wife, Sarah." I stepped forward, extending my hand with a smile that felt perfectly natural. "Hello, Marcus," I said. "It's so nice to meet you." For just a moment, he didn't react. He looked at me with the polite interest of someone meeting their boss's wife for the first time. And then, slowly, recognition dawned. I watched it happen in stages. First, confusion. Something familiar about my face, but he couldn't quite place it. Then a flicker of memory, a mental comparison between the woman standing before him and someone from his past. And finally, complete and utter shock as the pieces fell into place. His hand went limp in mine, and the color drained from his face so completely that for a moment I thought he might faint. "Sarah?" he whispered, and I could hear the disbelief in his voice. "Yes," I replied calmly, still holding his hand. "Sarah Henderson now, actually." David's wife. David, oblivious to the undercurrents of the conversation, beamed with pride. "Isn't she wonderful? I'm the luckiest man in the world." Marcus's eyes darted between David and me, clearly struggling to process what was happening. I could practically see the thoughts racing through his mind. How was this possible? How had his ex-girlfriend become his boss's wife? How had the woman he'd left broken and humiliated ended up in a position of such power over his career? I dot, he stammered, and I realized with a surge of satisfaction that Marcus Thompson, the man who had always been so smooth, so confident, so sure of his ability to charm his way through any situation, was completely speechless. "Are you feeling all right?" David asked, noticing Marcus's pale complexion. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Marcus managed to say, his voice hoarse. "Well, come on," David said, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Let me get you a drink and introduce you to everyone else." As David led Marcus toward the living room, our eyes met one final time. In that look, I saw everything I needed to see: fear, panic, the dawning realization that his fate was now, quite literally, in my hands. I followed them into the living room, watching as David introduced Marcus to the other guests. To his credit, Marcus managed to pull himself together enough to engage in polite conversation, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept darting back to me. The dinner conversation was lively and engaging, covering everything from market trends to travel experiences. I played the perfect hostess, ensuring everyone felt included and comfortable, while also demonstrating the kind of intelligence and sophistication that had made me successful in my own right. Several times during the meal, I caught Marcus staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't the old desire I might have expected, or even nostalgia for what we'd once had. It was something else, a mixture of amazement and what looked almost like grief. "Sarah," said Janet, one of the senior partners, "David tells us you're in marketing. What's your specialty?" "Brand transformation," I replied, taking a sip of wine. "I help companies reinvent themselves, usually after they've experienced some kind of setback or scandal. It's all about changing the narrative, showing the world who you really are rather than who they think you are." I felt Marcus's eyes on me as I spoke, and I wondered if he was picking up on the subtext of my words. "That must be challenging work," commented Robert, another colleague. "How do you handle clients who are resistant to change?" "Oh, that's the easy part," I said with a smile. "Change is inevitable. The only question is whether you're going to control it or let it control you. I prefer to be in control." The conversation moved on to other topics, but I noticed that Marcus remained unusually quiet for the rest of the meal. He answered when spoken to directly, but he seemed distracted, lost in his own thoughts. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Marcus was among the last to go. He lingered in the foyer, clearly wanting to speak with me but unsure how to manage it with David present. "Marcus," David said, "I'm glad we had a chance to talk tonight. I'd like to schedule some time next week to discuss that partnership track we mentioned." "Of course," Marcus replied, though his voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. "I look forward to it." David excused himself to take a phone call from his daughter, leaving Marcus and me alone in the foyer for the first time all evening. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 10 years of history and unspoken questions. Finally, Marcus cleared his throat. "Sarah, I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," I replied calmly. "Just go home, Marcus. We'll talk when we need to." He looked like he wanted to say more, but David's voice could be heard approaching from the other room. Marcus grabbed his coat and headed for the door, pausing just long enough to look back at me one more time. You look incredible," he said quietly. "Happy. I'm glad." I watched him go, then closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, processing what had just happened. The evening had gone even better than I'd hoped. Marcus was clearly shaken, clearly struggling to understand how his past had collided so dramatically with his present. But this was just the beginning. The real fun was yet to come. David returned from his phone call with an apologetic smile. "Sorry about that. Sarah had a question about her college applications." He paused, studying my face. "Everything okay? You look a little flushed." "Just tired," I said. "It was a long evening, but a successful one, I think. Everyone seemed to have a great time, and I think Marcus was particularly impressed. That could be important for his future with the company." "Yes," I agreed, unable to suppress a small smile. "I think Marcus's future is about to become very interesting indeed." As we cleaned up and prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about the look on Marcus's face when he'd realized who I was. 10 years ago, he'd seen me as someone he could discard, someone whose feelings didn't matter enough to prevent him from pursuing a younger, more exciting option. Tonight, he'd seen me as someone with real power over his professional life, someone who could influence his future in ways he was probably just beginning to understand. The woman he'd left crying in a parking lot was now the wife of his CEO, the woman whose opinion could make or break his career aspirations. The irony was so perfect it felt like destiny. But I wasn't done yet. Tonight had been about establishing the new reality, about making sure Marcus understood exactly how much had changed. What came next would be about making sure he never forgot the lesson he was about to learn. As I lay in bed that night, listening to David's steady breathing beside me, I began to plan my next move. Marcus would be anxious now, wondering what I was going to do with the power I held over him. He'd be looking for signs of what was coming, trying to read my intentions. I was going to keep him guessing for a while longer. Let him sweat. Let him wonder. Let him experience just a fraction of the uncertainty and fear I'd felt during those awful weeks after our breakup. And then, when the time was right, I was going to show him exactly what it felt like to have someone else control his destiny. The dish was getting colder by the day, and soon it would be perfectly chilled. The first few days after the dinner party were deliciously quiet. I went about my normal routine: morning coffee with David, work calls from my home office, evening walks along the river, while knowing that somewhere across the city, Marcus was probably losing his mind trying to figure out what I was planning to do. The beauty of it was that I didn't have to do anything at all. Just the knowledge that I existed, that I was married to his boss, that I had access to information about his career and his future. That was torture enough for someone like Marcus, who had always needed to feel in control of every situation. David mentioned him casually over breakfast on Tuesday morning. That Marcus Thompson is an interesting guy, he said, scrolling through emails on his tablet. Very talented, but he seemed a bit off his game at the party. Nervous, maybe. I murmured non-committally, though inside I was practically purring with satisfaction. First impressions can be deceiving. True. I'm having lunch with him today to discuss his performance metrics and the partnership possibility. Should be an interesting conversation. I nearly choked on my coffee. Marcus was having lunch with David today? The poor man was probably going to spend the entire meal wondering if I'd told my husband about our history, if David knew that his star employee had once destroyed his wife's heart. The paranoia must be eating him alive. I hope it goes well, I said, and I meant it. I wanted Marcus to succeed just enough to stay hopeful, just enough to believe he had a chance at the partnership. The higher he climbed, the further he'd have to fall when I was ready to push him. After David left for work, I found myself restless, unable to concentrate on my own projects. I kept thinking about that lunch meeting, imagining Marcus trying to read David's expressions, searching for any sign that his boss knew about our past. The thought of him squirming through small talk and performance reviews, wondering if every question had a hidden meaning, filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't expected to feel. My phone rang around noon. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about it looked familiar. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Hello? Sarah. The voice was barely above a whisper, but I recognized it immediately. Marcus. I'm sorry, who is this? I asked innocently. You know who it is? His voice was strained, desperate. We need to talk. I'm not sure what we have to talk about, I replied calmly. I don't believe we know each other well enough for personal conversations. Sarah, please. There was actual panic in his voice now. I need to know what you're going to tell David. Tell him about what? The silence stretched between us for a long moment. I could practically hear him struggling to find the right words, trying to figure out how to acknowledge our past without saying anything that could be used against him later. About us, he finally said. About before. Before what? I was enjoying this far more than I should have been. I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to. God damn it, Sarah. I think you have me confused with someone else, I interrupted smoothly. And I don't appreciate strange men calling my personal number and using profanity. I'm going to hang up now. Wait! The desperation in his voice was palpable. Please, I ended the call and immediately blocked the number. Let him think about that for a while. Let him wonder if I was going to report the inappropriate call to David, or if I was simply choosing to ignore his existence entirely. Either possibility would drive him crazy. The house phone rang 20 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail, and sure enough, it was Marcus again, this time calling from his office. Sarah, it's Marcus Thompson from David's firm. I think we may have gotten disconnected earlier. If you could please call me back, I'd really appreciate the chance to clear up any misunderstanding. His voice was carefully professional this time, but I could hear the underlying tension. He was trying to make it sound like a business call in case David somehow heard the message, but the subtext was clear. He was begging. I didn't call him back. David came home that evening in an excellent mood, whistling as he hung up his coat and loosened his tie. Good day? I asked, kissing him hello. Very good. That lunch with Marcus went extremely well. He's definitely partnership material. Smart, dedicated, hungry for success. I think he could be a real asset to the firm's future. That's wonderful, I said, and watched David's face light up with enthusiasm. He asked about you, actually. Said he was impressed by your intelligence and sophistication. Mentioned that he'd love to get to know us better as a couple. Of course he had. Marcus was probably trying to figure out if he could somehow charm his way back into my good graces, or at least assess how much of a threat I really posed to his career. "How thoughtful," I murmured. "I was thinking," David continued, "maybe we should have him over for dinner sometime. Just the three of us. It would be a good way to build that personal connection that's so important in business relationships." The opportunity was so perfect I almost laughed out loud. "That sounds like a lovely idea." "Great. I'll mention it to him tomorrow." That night, as David slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake planning the most exquisite torture I could devise for Marcus Thompson. A private dinner, just the three of us, where he'd have to sit at my table, eat my food, and pretend to make polite conversation while knowing that every word he spoke could be his last as David's golden boy. I was going to make him suffer the way I'd suffered, not with one dramatic confrontation, but with the slow, steady erosion of security and peace of mind. He was going to learn what it felt like to walk on eggshells, to second-guess every interaction, to lie awake at night wondering if the person who held his future in their hands was planning to destroy him. The next morning, David called Marcus from his office and extended the dinner invitation. I happened to be there, dropping off some documents David had forgotten at home, and I got to witness Marcus's reaction in real time. "That's very generous," Marcus said, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "I'd be honored." David put the call on speaker without thinking about it, a habit he'd developed for important business conversations. "How about Friday night? 7 o'clock? Perfect. Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself. Sarah's an excellent cook and she loves having guests." I smiled sweetly at the phone, even though Marcus couldn't see me. "I'm looking forward to it," I said loudly enough for him to hear. The pause that followed was so long I thought the call might have dropped. Then Marcus cleared his throat. I'm looking forward to it too." After David ended the call, he turned to me with a pleased expression. "This is exactly the kind of relationship building that helps companies succeed. Personal connections matter." "They certainly do," I agreed. The next few days passed in a blur of menu planning and psychological warfare. I chose the most labor-intensive recipes I could find, dishes that would require me to be in and out of the kitchen constantly, creating opportunities for Marcus and David to be alone together. I wanted Marcus to spend the entire evening terrified that I was going to walk back into the room and announce that he'd once cheated on me with a woman young enough to be his daughter. I also did something I hadn't done in years. I looked him up online. Social media, professional profiles, local news mentions. I wanted to know everything about the life he'd built since our breakup. What I found was both pathetic and satisfying. Marcus had indeed dated several women since our relationship ended, but nothing had stuck. His LinkedIn profile showed a series of job changes, each one a lateral move rather than a promotion. He'd bought a condo in what used to be considered a trendy neighborhood, but was now overpriced and trying too hard to maintain its hipster credibility. His Facebook photos showed him at various bars and networking events, always smiling but never looking quite natural. Most telling were the photos from the past 2 years. He looked tired, older than his 38 years. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. His smile had taken on a desperate quality, the expression of someone who was trying to convince the world, and maybe himself, that he was living his best life. The man who'd once been so confident, so sure of his own charm and appeal, had become just another middle-aged guy struggling to stay relevant in a young person's game. And now he was working for my husband, hoping for a promotion that could change his trajectory, not knowing that his fate rested in the hands of the woman he'd once considered disposable. Friday arrived with all the anticipation of Christmas morning. I spent the day preparing, choosing my outfit carefully, elegant but not trying too hard, beautiful but not seductive. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a successful woman who had built a wonderful life for herself. I wanted Marcus to see everything he'd given up, everything he could have had if he'd been capable of loyalty and commitment. At 6:30, I was putting the finishing touches on the appetizers when the doorbell rang. Marcus was early, probably because he'd been too nervous to wait any longer. I could hear David greeting him at the door, the easy camaraderie of two professional men who respected each other. If only David knew what kind of man he was really dealing with. "Marcus," David's voice carried from the foyer. "Right on time?" Come in, come in." "Thank you for having me," Marcus replied, and I could hear the careful control in his voice. "Your home is beautiful. Wait until you see Sarah's cooking. She's outdone herself tonight." I appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, wiping my hands on a dish towel and smiling warmly. "Marcus, welcome." He was holding a bottle of wine, expensive wine, I noticed. Probably cost him more than he could afford, but he was trying to make the right impression. When he saw me, his face went through the now familiar cycle of recognition and panic, though he recovered more quickly this time. "Sarah," he said carefully. "Thank you for having me." "Of course. David speaks so highly of you." I took the wine from his hands, letting my fingers brush against his for just a moment. He flinched like I'd burned him. "This is lovely." I continued, examining the label. 2018 Bordeaux. "Excellent choice." "I wasn't sure what you'd be serving," he said. "Well, you'll just have to wait and see, won't you?" The first hour was a masterclass in psychological torture disguised as polite dinner conversation. I flitted between the kitchen and living room, serving appetizers and making small talk while Marcus tried to navigate the increasingly treacherous waters of the evening. David, oblivious to the undercurrents, was in his element, discussing business strategy and market trends with someone he clearly considered a valuable colleague. Marcus, to his credit, managed to hold up his end of the conversation, but I could see the strain in his posture, the way his eyes kept darting to me whenever I entered the room. "Sarah," David said as I refreshed their drinks. "Marcus was just telling me about his background before joining the firm. Apparently, he used to live here in the city before moving away for a few years." "Oh, really?" I said with perfectly calibrated interest. "What brought you back?" Marcus swallowed hard. "Career opportunities," he said vaguely. "Sometimes you have to go backward to move forward." "How true," I replied. "I've found that the past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you try to run from it." The color drained from his face, but David nodded approvingly. "Sarah's very wise about these things. She's helped me navigate some challenging situations in my own career." "I can imagine," Marcus said weakly. Dinner was an exercise in exquisite torture. I'd prepared coq au vin, a dish that required constant attention and gave me plenty of excuses to leave the table and return unexpectedly. Each time I came back from the kitchen, Marcus looked like he'd been holding his breath, waiting for me to drop some bombshell into the conversation. "This is incredible," David said, savoring the chicken. "Marcus, you're in for a treat. Sarah's cooking is one of the many reasons I married her." "One of many," I agreed, smiling at my husband with genuine affection, before turning that same smile on Marcus. David's very easy to please. He appreciates quality when he finds it. Marcus nearly choked on his wine. "Sarah's being modest," David continued. "She's accomplished in her own right, built an incredibly successful marketing career, overcame some personal challenges that would have broken a lesser person. She's the strongest woman I know." "Personal challenges?" Marcus asked, and I could hear the fear in his voice. "Oh, the usual," I said with a dismissive wave of my hand. "Bad relationships, broken hearts, the kind of thing that teaches you what you really want in life." I paused to take a sip of wine, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Marcus squirm. But those experiences shaped me into who I am today. I learned not to settle for less than I deserve, not to waste time on people who don't value what they have. Sometimes the worst things that happen to you turn out to be blessings in disguise. David reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm certainly grateful for whatever brought you to me." "Me too," I said, looking directly at Marcus. "Sometimes someone has to break your heart before you can find your real happiness." Marcus set down his fork with shaking hands. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "Could I use your restroom?" "Of course," David said. "Down the hall, second door on the right." As soon as Marcus left the room, David turned to me with concern. "Is everything okay?" "He seems really nervous tonight. More nervous than I'd expect, even for dinner with the boss." "Maybe he's just overwhelmed," I suggested. "Big opportunity trying to make a good impression. Some people don't handle pressure well." "Maybe," David said, but he looked thoughtful. He's usually much more confident in professional settings. Marcus returned a few minutes later, having apparently splashed water on his face and given himself a pep talk in the mirror, but the strain was showing now. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up his fork, and there was a sheen of perspiration on his forehead, despite the comfortable temperature in the room. "So Marcus," I said conversationally, "David mentioned you were married before?" The fork clattered against his plate. "Divorced," he said tersely. "I'm sorry to hear that. Divorce can be so difficult." "It was amicable," he managed. "That's rare," I observed. "Most breakups involve hurt feelings, betrayal, that sort of thing." "You were lucky." Marcus's laugh was hollow and bitter. "I'm not sure luck had much to do with it." "Well," I said, standing to clear the dinner plates. I've always believed that people get what they deserve in the end. Karma has a way of balancing the scales. As I carried the dishes to the kitchen, I heard David trying to fill the uncomfortable silence with talk about upcoming client presentations. Marcus's responses were increasingly monosyllabic. His earlier conversational skills completely evaporated under the weight of his anxiety. I took my time with dessert preparation, letting the two men sit alone together while Marcus undoubtedly wondered if this was the moment I'd chosen to reveal our history. When I finally returned with a tray of chocolate mousse and coffee, Marcus looked like he'd aged 5 years in 20 minutes. "I hope everyone saved room for dessert," I said cheerfully. "It looks amazing," David said. "Doesn't it, Marcus?" "Beautiful," Marcus whispered. As we ate dessert, I regaled them with stories from my marketing career, carefully chosen anecdotes about turning around damaged brands and helping companies recover from scandals. Each story had a subtext that Marcus couldn't possibly miss: themes of accountability, consequences, and the price of betrayal. "The key," I said, "is understanding that reputation is everything. Once it's damaged, it's almost impossible to rebuild. That's why integrity is so important, especially in professional relationships. One mistake, one betrayal of trust, and your entire career can be destroyed." Marcus had stopped eating entirely. His dessert sat untouched in front of him while he stared at the table, looking like a man awaiting execution. "You're absolutely right," David agreed. "That's why character is so important in hiring decisions. Skills can be taught, but integrity is something you either have or you don't." "Exactly," I said, my eyes fixed on Marcus. "Some people will do anything to get what they want, regardless of who they hurt in the process. But eventually, their true nature always reveals itself." The evening finally wound down around 10 o'clock. Marcus had barely spoken for the last hour, responding to direct questions with one-word answers and declining offers of more coffee or after-dinner drinks. He looked like he wanted nothing more than to escape, but he was trapped by social conventions and professional obligations. "This has been wonderful," David said as we walked Marcus to the door. "We should do it again soon." "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "For everything." "It was my pleasure," I said warmly. "I do hope we'll see more of each other." The look he gave me was pure terror. After Marcus left, David and I cleaned up in comfortable silence. He seemed pleased with how the evening had gone, though he mentioned again that Marcus had seemed unusually nervous. "Maybe he's just intimidated by the partnership possibility," I suggested. "Some people put too much pressure on themselves." "Could be," David agreed. "I'll keep an eye on him. Make sure he knows he has my support." That night, I lay in bed feeling more satisfied than I had in years. The evening had been perfect. Marcus had suffered exactly the way I'd wanted him to suffer, and David remained completely oblivious to the real dynamics at play. Best of all, I'd managed to plant seeds of doubt about Marcus's character without saying anything explicitly damaging. David was now watching his star employee more carefully, looking for signs that something wasn't quite right. The next phase of my plan would require more patience. I needed to let Marcus stew for a while, wondering what was coming next. I needed him to make mistakes born of anxiety and paranoia, and I needed to position myself as the innocent party when everything finally came crashing down around him. Over the next few weeks, I made sure to maintain a subtle but consistent presence in Marcus's professional life. I started dropping by David's office occasionally, timing my visits to coincide with meetings or conversations involving Marcus. I'd appear in the conference room doorway with coffee for David, exchange pleasantries with the team, and leave, but not before making eye contact with Marcus and smiling in a way that could be interpreted as either friendly or menacing. I also began attending more of David's work events. Company parties, client dinners, professional conferences, anywhere Marcus might be present, I was there too, always perfectly dressed, always charming, always just visible enough in his peripheral vision to remind him that I was watching. The psychological pressure was taking its toll. Through David, I heard that Marcus's performance was becoming erratic. He'd missed a few deadlines, stumbled through presentations that should have been routine, and seemed distracted during important client meetings. "I'm starting to worry about him," David confided over dinner one evening. "He's not the same guy I hired. Something's off." "Maybe he's having personal problems," I suggested. "Sometimes people's private lives affect their work performance." "Maybe. But I can't afford to have a partner who isn't completely reliable. The firm's reputation is at stake." 3 months after our private dinner, David called me at work with news that made my heart race with anticipation. "I've made a decision about Marcus," he said without preamble. "Oh? I'm not going to offer him the partnership. His performance has been too inconsistent lately, and I need people I can count on completely." I closed my eyes and savored the moment. That's probably wise. I feel bad about it, though. He seemed so promising at first. "Sometimes people aren't who they appear to be," I said softly. "You can only judge someone by their actions, not their potential." True. I'm going to have the conversation with him this afternoon. That afternoon, I found excuses to be near David's office. I wanted to see Marcus's face when he received the news that his dreams of partnership, of professional redemption, were being crushed. I positioned myself in the break room, which had a clear view of David's office door, and waited. Marcus arrived at 3 o'clock sharp, wearing his best suit and carrying a leather portfolio that probably contained charts and presentations supporting his case for promotion. He looked nervous but hopeful, like a man who thought he was about to receive the opportunity of a lifetime. He emerged 37 minutes later looking like he'd been hit by a truck. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped, and the portfolio hung loosely from his hand as if he'd forgotten he was carrying it. He walked past the break room without seeing me, his eyes vacant and defeated. That evening, David came home looking tired but relieved. "How did Marcus take the news?" I asked. "About as well as expected. He was disappointed, of course, but he took it professionally. Asked what he could do to improve his performance." "What did you tell him?" "That he needs to focus on consistency and reliability. That maybe in a year or two, if he can get back to his original level of performance, we could revisit the conversation." A year or two. By then, I'd be done with Marcus Thompson entirely. By then, he'd be nothing more than a cautionary tale about the importance of treating people with respect and dignity. But I wasn't finished yet. The partnership denial was just the beginning of his education. Over the next few months, I began to escalate my psychological campaign. I started sending Marcus anonymous gifts at work. Flowers on Valentine's Day with no card, a bottle of expensive champagne on his birthday with a note that said, "From an admirer." Each gift was carefully chosen to ratchet up his paranoia while maintaining plausible deniability. I also began commenting on his social media posts, nothing obvious or threatening, just occasional likes or brief, innocuous comments that would remind him of my presence in his life. When he posted a photo from a weekend hiking trip, I'd like it. When he shared an article about business trends, I'd comment with something like, "Interesting perspective." He started to change his privacy settings, but by then, the damage was done. He knew I was watching. The masterpiece of my campaign came 6 months later, when David mentioned that the firm was planning a company retreat to a resort in the mountains. All senior staff would be required to attend, along with their spouses and partners. "It'll be a great team-building opportunity," David explained. 3 days of workshops, strategic planning sessions, and social activities. "Sounds wonderful," I said, already planning my wardrobe for what would be Marcus's ultimate psychological torture. The retreat was held at a luxury lodge nestled in the mountains, the kind of place that appeared in travel magazines and corporate brochures. David and I arrived on Thursday afternoon and were immediately swept into a round of cocktails and meet and greets with the other couples. Marcus had arrived alone, of course. I'd done enough research to know that he wasn't seriously dating anyone, a string of brief relationships that never seemed to develop into anything meaningful. He stood at the edge of the cocktail party, nursing a beer and making awkward conversation with colleagues' spouses, looking like exactly what he was, a man who'd prioritized the wrong things and was now paying the price for his choices. Poor Marcus, I said to David as we watched him from across the room. He looks lonely. "I should introduce him to some people," David said, ever the considerate boss. "Actually," I said, touching David's arm, "maybe I should talk to him. Sometimes it's easier to connect with someone when there's no professional hierarchy involved." David smiled at me with the kind of adoration that still made my heart flutter after all these years together. "You're incredible, you know that? Always thinking about other people." I walked across the room to where Marcus stood alone by the windows, looking out at the mountain vista. When he saw me approaching, his entire body tensed. "Beautiful view?" I said conversationally, joining him at the window. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is. You know, Marcus, I've been thinking about you lately." His head snapped toward me, eyes wide with alarm. "You have?" David's been worried about your performance. He cares about you, you know. Wants to see you succeed." "I'm doing my best," he said defensively. "Are you?" I turned to face him fully, studying his features in the golden light filtering through the windows. Because from where I stand, it looks like you're struggling, like something's eating at you. I don't know what you mean. Don't you? I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I think you know exactly what I mean. We stood there in silence for a long moment, the weight of 10 years of history settling between us like a living thing. Around us, the cocktail party continued. Laughter, clinking glasses, animated conversations about business and vacation plans. But we existed in our own bubble of tension and unresolved pain. "What do you want from me?" Marcus finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Want from you?" I repeated, as if the question surprised me. "I don't want anything from you, Marcus. I have everything I need." I gestured toward where David stood across the room, deep in conversation with another executive. He caught my eye and smiled, raising his glass in a small toast. I waved back, feeling genuinely happy in that moment. "I have a husband who loves and respects me," I continued, turning back to Marcus. "A successful career, a beautiful home, a life full of meaning and purpose. What could you possibly give me that I don't already have?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly struggling to find words that wouldn't make his situation worse. "The thing is," I said conversationally, "I used to think about revenge. In those early days after you left, when I was crying myself to sleep every night and wondering what was wrong with me, I used to fantasize about getting back at you somehow." Marcus's face had gone pale, but he remained silent. "But you know what I realized? The best revenge isn't something you do to someone. It's something you become in spite of them." I turned to look at David again, my expression softening with genuine affection. "You gave me the greatest gift imaginable, Marcus. You showed me that I deserved better than what I was settling for. If you hadn't left me for that child, I never would have become the woman I am today. I never would have met David, never would have built this life, never would have discovered my own strength." When I looked back at Marcus, there were tears in his eyes. "So thank you," I said simply. "Thank you for being exactly who you were. Thank you for choosing her over me. Thank you for breaking my heart so completely that I had no choice but to rebuild it stronger." I started to walk away, then paused and looked back at him one final time. "Oh, and Marcus? About that partnership you wanted so badly? David's right to be cautious. Character really is everything in business. Once someone shows you who they are, you'd be foolish not to believe them." I rejoined David across the room, slipping my arm through his and smiling up at him with all the love and gratitude I felt for this good man who'd helped me heal from wounds I'd thought would never stop bleeding. "Everything okay?" David asked, noticing my slightly flushed appearance. "Perfect," I said and meant it. "Everything is absolutely perfect." The rest of the retreat passed in a blur of workshops and team-building exercises, group dinners, and evening entertainment. Marcus participated mechanically, going through the motions of professional engagement while looking like a man serving a prison sentence. Several people commented on his subdued demeanor, and I overheard David expressing concern to another executive about whether Marcus was really suited for the senior-level responsibilities they'd been considering for him. On the final evening, there was a farewell dinner followed by dancing and drinks in the lodge's main ballroom. David and I danced to several songs, lost in our own world of comfortable intimacy and shared joy. I felt lighter than I had in years, as if a weight I'd been carrying for a decade had finally been lifted from my shoulders. As we swayed to a slow song, I caught sight of Marcus sitting alone at the bar, staring into his drink with the thousand-yard stare of a defeated man. For just a moment, I felt something that might have been pity. But then I remembered the sound of that girl's laughter coming from our bedroom, the humiliation of canceling wedding invitations, the months of self-doubt and pain that had followed our breakup. Marcus Thompson had made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. He'd gambled on the idea that he could discard people without repercussions, that his actions wouldn't follow him into his future. He'd been wrong. The music ended, and David spun me around with a flourish that made me laugh out loud. As I came to a stop facing the bar, Marcus looked up and our eyes met one final time. There was something in his expression that I'd never seen before. Not just defeat, but understanding. He finally got it. He finally understood the true cost of what he'd done, not just to me, but to himself. I didn't smile or nod or acknowledge him in any way. I simply looked at him for a moment, then turned my attention back to my husband, the man who'd shown me what real love looked like. 3 weeks after we returned from the retreat, David came home with news that surprised me less than it should have. Marcus handed in his resignation today, he said, loosening his tie as he settled into his favorite armchair. Really? Why? Said he'd gotten an offer from a firm in Denver. Better opportunity, chance for a fresh start. Are you sorry to see him go? David considered the question for a moment. Honestly? No. I think it's for the best. He never quite fit the culture here, and lately his performance has been inconsistent. Sometimes it's better to cut your losses and move on. I'm sure he'll do better in a new environment, I said diplomatically. Maybe. Although I have to say, I'm not sure the problem was the environment. Some people carry their problems with them wherever they go. That night, alone in my home office while David watched television in the living room, I did something I hadn't done in months. I looked up Marcus Thompson online. His LinkedIn profile had been updated to reflect his new position in Denver, a lateral move at best, possibly even a step backward. The photos from his farewell happy hour showed him smiling with forced enthusiasm, surrounded by colleagues who looked like they were merely going through the motions of wishing him well. He looked older, more worn down than ever. The confident, charming man I'd fallen in love with over a decade ago was gone, replaced by someone who seemed defeated by life rather than energized by it. For a moment, I wondered if I'd gone too far, if my campaign of psychological warfare had been crueler than his original betrayal deserved. But then I thought about the woman I'd become, confident, successful, genuinely happy in ways I'd never imagined possible. I thought about David, snoring softly on the couch with a book fallen open across his chest, and the life we'd built together. I thought about all the opportunities that had opened up for me, all the growth and healing that had happened, all because I'd been forced to start over. Marcus Thompson had given me the greatest gift of my life. He'd shown me that I was strong enough to survive anything, that I deserved better than what I'd been settling for, that I was capable of building something beautiful from the ashes of my broken dreams. Closing the laptop, I walked back to the living room and gently woke David, helping him to bed and settling in beside him with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The past was finally truly behind me. The dish had been served, consumed, and cleared away. Justice, as it turned out, really was best served cold, and after 10 years, it had been absolutely perfect. As I drifted off to sleep in the arms of the man who'd helped me heal, I realized that the best revenge really wasn't revenge at all. It was moving forward, building something better, and becoming someone worthy of the love and respect that everyone deserves. Marcus Thompson was someone else's problem now. My story, the real story, the one that mattered, was just beginning.